We would say, imagine that you've got a bag of poker chips, and each time that you give a chip away, okay, that's potentially something to do with your confidence or your self esteem. You'll always have a child who's either only got one or two poker chips in it, or their bag's really small, and so trying to get it out is really, really hard. And they'll spend most of their time thinking about the fact of, when am I going to use that? So they might not engage, they might not say anything, because their fear is if they use their one thing and they get it wrong, what else have they got left? They might as well give up and walk out.
So, welcome to episode 6 of the Tricky to Title podcast. I'm luckily joined by Mr. I feel like I have to say Mr. I don't know why.
You can just call me Glenn, that's fine.
I can't. I just them. So, Glenn Golding is an executive head teacher, been a primary school teacher for 26 years, 15 of which have been in the executive head teacher role. We'll explore what an executive head teacher is in a second, because I'm not sure everybody's come across one of those. Today we're going to be covering the kind of similarities, the differences between corporate learning and the educational sector, specifically covering kind of, like, for me, what corporate learning can learn from the educational sector. I think often it's felt like it's the other way around, and I do think the educational sector has a lot to offer us. So specifically around governance, experiential learning, so learning by doing, and also then thinking about inclusivity and neurodiversity and how that's embedded within kind of the school ethos and architecture, and what corporate learning can pick from that. As ever, we have an activity to do. So if you've seen this before, then great. If you haven't, we both have some mugs, and we're going to, throughout the podcast, decorate our mugs. I, for each episode so far, have been trying to draw Dave, who I'll come on to in a minute. Last episode, Dave looked quite a lot like a pig, which wasn't fantastic. So we're going to continually try and evolve my ability, i.e. I should be doing some experiential learning. Thank you very much. Dave will join us. So Dave is a donkey. Again, if you've heard this before, then tough, you're hearing it again. Dave joins every podcast. He was present in a car that we bought a long time ago, 14 years ago, just randomly in it. The guy that sold it didn't know why he was there, and he had a little tag around his neck that just said, "Hi, I'm Dave and I'm ready to rave." So he is now stuck around forever since then, and is my lucky mascot. And then lastly, principle of this podcast is there is no selling. This is just an opportunity to meet really interesting people who are going to talk about really interesting things. So no pressure, Glenn.
No, thank you.
Really interesting. So let's kick off. I guess the first thing really is, what is an executive head teacher?
An executive head teacher can actually look different depending on where in the country you actually do that role.
Okay.
So, for example, in Hampshire, there's not that many multi-academy trusts. Most schools are standalone, particularly at primary level. So what the atypical leadership model would be is you have a standalone school, you have your deputy head, your head teacher, and your governing body. Outside of Hampshire, you have groups of schools that are put together that become multi-academy trusts. And you can have a whole variety of models there. So you might have a CEO and a central team that basically oversee anything between 10 to 50 to 100 schools. Okay. And then you can have multiple executive heads across that structure looking after a number of schools. Okay. So you're ultimately an executive head if you look after more than one school.
Fine. Okay. So how many schools do you look after?
I look after 5.
5.
Okay. But my role is a slightly... It's kind of a combination of CEO and executive head. And the reason for that is in Hampshire, they don't really have academies. So my 5 schools are all local authority maintained schools.
Right.
So I'm the named head teacher at all 5, but I have heads of schools, which basically is a deputy head, but with a different title. So they run the day-to-day basis, and then my job is looking at the strategic. So I spend most of my time looking at governance, looking at policies, looking at finance, looking at strategy, and then holding the heads of schools accountable for delivering on what's on the school's improvement plan.
Perfect. Okay, good. Helpful explanation. Thank you. So let's then talk about governance. We'll kick off there, right? I think hopefully most of our watchers and listeners understand that schools are pretty heavily governed, given what they're trying to achieve. Obviously, you have Ofsted, you've got the local authorities you've spoken about, you've got the governors, you've got parents. The corporate learning is, I would say, much less governed. Some have quite good governance strategies in place. Probably many don't necessarily have quite good governance structures in place. It would be good to understand from your perspective, when you think about the way schools are governed, what's the kind of positives that you see from that? And what are also some of those downsides? Are there kind of restrictions to the way that you would want to deliver learning and teaching versus the way that you kind of have to deliver that for the outcomes, or the way that outcomes are necessarily measured? Do you feel that sometimes that governance can restrict a little bit more creativity or a bit more thought about the right outcomes, etc., etc.? So, from your perspective, when you think about your governance, what's good, what works quite well?
In terms of the positive side, whether it's a charity, a school, or a business, if it's not regulated, if there's not a board of governors, if there's not a board of trustees or directors that are basically holding the senior leaders to account for certain aspects of their role, then you could foresee that having a negative effect on the actual quality of what they're delivering. And obviously in my role, that would mean that the outcomes for children and their experience and their readiness to move on to secondary school would be negatively impacted. From my point of view, the positive side of the governance, and you are right, it's not just the governing body, it is the local authority, it's the DFE, it's Ofsted, it's parents' expectations as well. What that ultimately does is it tends to focus more around health and safety and safeguarding. Right. So most of what we have to do in terms of where you've got no real ownership or control is from how you appoint people to the checks that you have to do from premises, from safeguarding, statutory training that all teachers or anyone who works in the building has to undertake. So it tends to be more around health and safety, buildings and maintenance, and safeguarding. Yep. In terms of your ownership over what you are focusing on from a training perspective for all your staff, then schools have complete autonomy on that one. But obviously where you're judged is your training has to directly link into your school improvement plan, and your school improvement plan should directly link to your self-evaluation that's taken place. Yep. So your improvement plan might not be a yearly plan. Quite often targets are based on a year, because obviously the way we're measured is producing pupil outcomes each year. So whether or not it's foundation stage outcomes or phonics outcomes or key stage 2 outcomes, you know that you're going to get a set of data that comes through each year, and that the local authority and Ofsted are basically going to view that to see whether you're an effective school or not. Yep. And so in your improvement plan, there are a significant chunk of targets that are based on trying to improve outcomes for children based on what you've learned from the year before. Yep. Okay. But in terms of how you do that, you do have autonomy. So you don't have the local authority don't come in and look at what your training menu has been for the year. Ofsted don't look at it either. So they don't directly link through the pupil outcomes to what you've been training. They just look at it more generally from a leadership management point of view, as in, do you know your school? Do you know your gaps? And what are you doing to try to address those? Yeah.
So I think there's a couple of things I'd like to pick up on there, one of which is, I guess, is the school improvement plan that you've spoken about, right? And I guess I'll put this into corporate terms, right? So you were talking about kind of getting the data through at the end of the year. It's very similar in a corporate environment, right? We get lots of data about our employees, about how they're performing, what's good, what's not. Lots of organizations still work on a kind of yearly learning needs analysis, is kind of the corporate language for that, to understand kind of skills gaps and thinking about the strategy that the organization wants to achieve over the next year, and therefore what do we need to do to fill those gaps. But we don't necessarily create something in a similar way to the school improvement plan like schools do, where they're looking very closely at the weaknesses, but also putting in quite effective measures about how they tell whether that has improved or not. And you mentioned that Ofsted will look at that kind of school improvement plan and get a feel for, do you understand where the gaps are and what are you doing about it, and is what you're doing working? We don't necessarily have that oversight within the corporate environment, right? It's usually just then done by the learning teams themselves. So I think there's something in that improvement plan there for corporate kind of world to look at how we run learning needs analysis effectively, and what measures we're using, and actually who's reviewing that,
Okay.
and are there opportunities there. I think the other thing I wanted to pick up with you on is also then thinking about the curriculum for pupils as well. That's I'm going to say it feels like that's fairly fixed. Like there's things that you have to cover in order to meet that curriculum. But I assume that there isn't a kind of governance on how you deliver against that. It's more measuring the outcome is done through Ofsted and others. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. So how do you think what works well in that when it comes to kind of measuring that outcome? Because I guess a lot of people would say a lot of school measurement is focused solely on exams, right? Be that SATs or GCSEs. I'm not sure that's fair, and that might just be because parents get a lot of noise about exams. What's your view on that? Do you think that's true, or do you think actually there's a misunderstanding there of the broader measurement that happens throughout the year and later, and who kind of looks at that and does that?
In terms of, I'd say that the view of schools primarily being measured by like data outcomes, pupil outcomes,
Mm.
um, is possibly a bit dated now. In that it definitely used to be the way. So it used to be the case that you'd have the performance tables and parents could look to see where you were ranking, and it was compared, all of your data that you have to have published on the website would show how the school's comparing to similar schools of a similar nature, or
Yep.
to like the national average that's there as well. But in terms of the local authorities monitoring of schools and Ofsted's monitoring of schools now is very much broader in terms of what makes an effective school.
Okay.
And what I think's key is I think that the most effective schools, if you go and visit an outstanding school, what you will find is the outstanding nature of that school is significantly more than the outcomes. And the reason why I believe that to be the case is that pupil outcomes and the data, or I'd probably go as far to say as 99.9% of teachers, is the byproduct of doing all the things that you care about and believe.
Okay.
So the curriculum is a set of objectives, which is content that you have to cover.
Mhm.
Okay. But how you cover it is completely up to yourself. So it's very much we can design the vehicle. So how children learn, when they learn it, how we make links together, the experiences that they have, you can bespoke that to your children, which is imperative. In my role as executive head, my 5 schools are all very different.
Yep.
So I've got small village schools, I've got church schools, I've got schools that serve a more, I wouldn't say deprived area, but the demographic are significantly different between the schools.
Yeah.
And so what will engage some children and some parents at one school won't with the other. So although in essence we're teaching them the same curriculum content, the way in which you're delivering that is being adapted based on what you feel is the best way for those children within that community. So you do get quite a lot of creative freedom in what a curriculum would look like. Obviously, if your end results are not impacted in a positive way, then people will ask questions whether or not that's appropriate. So when you have an Ofsted inspection now, what they're very much looking at is they look more at the journey and the process than the outcomes. And the reason why I feel that's more fair is because there's always context. So last year, I had one cohort of children went through, I think their reading results was 97% passed ARE, something 50, that's expected standard. 50% got greater depth standard. Now that's significantly above the national average, but as a group of children, they had very little barriers to face. There wasn't many children that have got SEND in that class. There was very little social care intervention. You had really supportive parents, whereas that's not atypical. And even in one school, as there's school variations between the schools, but there's also variations within the school. One cohort going through can be significantly different to the next. So I think the way they measure performance of schools now is far more fair, and it makes more sense to actually look at the journey and the process that the children go through rather than just the outcomes. But it is my complete belief that if you get really strong pupil outcomes, and what I mean by strong outcomes is that those children have made outstanding progress from their relative starting point.
Yeah.
It's the process which has enabled that.
Yeah.
It's not that you've suddenly just improved the outcome at the end.
I think that, and that there's some things in there that I just really want to pick out. I think the first is the link back to the school improvement plan, right?
Yep.
So if your outcomes aren't doing very well, it's not the outcome that you're looking at, right? It's what's happened in the build up to that, and in the education, right? That could be 7 years worth of learning
Yeah.
in there, right? And picking out where it's not working, it can be quite difficult, but really important to focus. I think the other bit that you mentioned is what we would call in the world of corporate as personalized learning, and everybody jumped on the bandwagon of that like 2 years ago, but schools have been doing it for an incredibly long period of time, right? Where you look at the child as an individual and think about how they best learn, but then also extrapolate that up into the environment that they're coming from, the group as a whole, the culture and the place that they live in, etc., etc. And I don't think we do that very well in the corporate environment. We tend to build one thing and then push it out to 10, 15, 20,000 people globally and go, well, there you go. You're going to understand that, right? And of course, that doesn't work and it doesn't fit and people don't engage. And then I guess the last piece for me was just your point about supportive parents. Again, linking that back into the corporate world, if we thought of the pupils as our employees, right, the parents are going to be the managers.
Yep.
And we know that makes a huge difference for us when you have a manager that is engaged and supportive of their employees' learning. Not only the engagement in the learning increases, but the outcome is always better. And a big part of that, I think, is the part that the reflection happens, right? Which is, I guess, that kind of almost like the homework for school in
Yep.
some cases, right? That opportunity to reflect on what's happened during the day, what the pupils have done. If we think about it from corporate, what the employees have been working on, giving them that time and space to reflect on it, but with someone to support them,
Yeah.
can really drive much better outcomes. And it's not always, I think probably schools face the same difficulties that corporate do, right? It's actually very hard to find en masse engaged populations of parents slash managers, right? They may be silently engaged in the background, but kind of.
What I would say on that though is I would never describe it as we find them. I would say that as a school we look to develop them.
Okay.
Okay, and the reason I would say that is if I think about a process of improvement planning, we always start at the same point.
Mhm.
And the same point is we want to review what's our kind of key purpose. So if not that I would want to speak about children's kind of products, but our job is ultimately to prepare children for the next stage of their life.
Yep.
So what we look at is we look at what range of skills, attitudes, dispositions do we think our children need to develop in able to be really successful at their next stage.
Yep.
Now, academic skills is only one part of that. So I would argue that a child that finished year 6 and was great adept in all and was going to go to secondary school and be able to cope with the curriculum doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be successful in the next stage.
Yeah.
You still need to have social skills. You need to have emotional resilience. You need to have motivation, ambition to want to keep on improving.
Yeah.
You've got to have the understanding that learning is challenging and it is difficult, and not to be fearful of making mistakes, but actually celebrate the fact that you get stuff wrong, because that gives you an opportunity to learn new things as well. So we always start off our improvement planning processes in what's our core purpose. And then what we try to do is think about, if that's our core purpose, how can we get buy-in from our stakeholders, all of them, in kind of internal and external as well. And what we do, like most schools do, is you'd basically set out what your core values are and you'd explain the why behind those core values.
Mm-hmm.
So with myself as a leader, one of the things that I do quite regularly is I look outside of education for tips and techniques as to how to do that, because primarily the vast majority of head teachers do not come from a business background. So we're not trained in HR, we're not trained in marketing, we're not trained in training adults.
Yeah.
We're trained in how you teach children. And so what I look to is to try and find ideas from either people that have got proven track records or people that get called in to do training at large companies who are successful. And so, for example, Simon Sinek's work on the importance of why, when he looks at if you want to get buy-in and if you want people to commit and you want people to trust you, then you need to make sure that you share the why and the purpose to start off with. So before we start talking about the kind of the micro nature of a single objectives within a single subject, we would always review almost like a triangle. What's our key purpose? What are our key values? Are they still the same? What's our as a school for this particular group of children? What are the key dispositions or behaviours that they need to develop? So, for example, that strand's the one that differs most between schools.
Yep.
So, I imagine it would be if you had different companies and they were taking their employees from different areas, I would imagine the social demographic of that area would reflect people's attitudes and behaviours to work.
Yep.
And so in that strand is the bit that we would look at and think, actually, for this group of children, reflectiveness, or being able to understand that making mistakes is a good thing is a really important part. Because if we're in an area that's, say, affluent, supportive parents, they've got, IT equipment at home, libraries, the parents model the value of education, and those children find education quite easy. It's atypical for children that find education really easy to be really bad when they don't know what to do.
Yeah.
So when they hit a stumbling block that they can't do, they go, actually, it's the topic's fault, it's the object's fault, it's the teacher's fault,
Yeah.
because I can't suddenly grasp this concept really easily.
Yeah.
And so what we might look at for that school is we need to develop more emotional resilience and understanding. A bit like the Carol Dweck work on fixed mindsets. So we would talk to the children about what a fixed mindset means, what an open mindset means, and how that can help you move on with life. So is that kind of band when you start looking at the learning behaviours that the children display, that's the bit that you'd adapt across the different schools. And then after the learning behaviours, what we would then look at is what are the best teaching and learning strategies for that group of children. So there's a wide range of strategies that teachers would use, but you almost create a toolkit of these are the best strategies for those children that we are teaching. And then it's after that that you think about how the content that fits into that as well, if that makes sense.
And it does make perfect sense.
So that's how we would look to get buy-in. And the key is that you share this with all stakeholders. So the children know the reason why we're teaching this way is because this is going to help you reach the core purpose that we believe is the right thing. And if parents are choosing your school, it's because when they walk around the school, the leaders all talk with the same passion about that key purpose, those key values, and that you can see the values dripping from the walls, not just in terms of the imagery that's up in the classrooms, but you can actually you walk into a classroom and you've got that buzz of active learning. You've got children making mistakes. You've got people that are celebrating the fact that they're stuck and they're kind of, rather than going, oh, this is stupid, that kind of thing.
Yeah. No, I was smiling a lot through that because and it comes back to, I guess, what I said at the beginning, right? I think people feel that there's a big difference between adult learning in a corporate environment and learning in an educational sector, and even down to as primary school level. And fundamentally, there isn't. Everything that you've just said applies in a corporate space, right? Equally, you just change the language slightly, right? And you stop talking about pupils and you start talking about employees, right? But the reality is basically the same. But corporate learning just doesn't have, in my experience of it, the same level of structure around thinking through those groups of employees and really building out stuff that works for them. Yeah. But also, to your point, including them as stakeholders, making sure they understand why things are delivered to them in the way that they're delivered and helping them to understand kind of the journey they're going to go on. That doesn't necessarily happen for employees. Often they just see kind of random bits of learning pushed at them or possibly even just offered to them, but with no clear pathway or understanding about, well, why am I doing this? What am I aiming towards? What is this going to help me do? What problem does this help me solve? And your point, I guess, about thinking about groups of learners that are very confident, are very able, and then get stuck and kind of get frustrated and give up. I think similarly, when you go and kind of get into adult learning, that's almost, you label that as ego, right? They're very confident about what they know and they know it, and then suddenly they come across something they don't, but they don't want to admit they don't know it, so they're just going to pretend, or they'll blame someone else or it's something else, right? So actually thinking through those groups, I think, in a more structured way within a corporate learning environment will really help not only to sell the learning, if you like, but also just fundamentally help get better outcomes for employees and for the company.
But pick up on the point you said
Mm.
about the way in which children learn to adults learn.
Yes.
My belief is that there is no, well, the only one difference I think there is, and it is that cliche that children can learn things easier than adults, only because like the neurologically, children's brains have got more plasticity to them.
Yep.
And also because of their lack of experience, when they go into a learning experience, they are not constrained by their experience of what's likely to happen.
Yeah.
So not necessarily prejudiced, but kind of
they inherently have a growth mindset, right?
Yeah, they will.
Yeah.
So for example, if you was to go and sit in a class of 4-year-olds, they probably ask individually on average 50 questions plus a day. Okay. If you go and sit in a year 6 class, they might ask 10. Okay. So ultimately, as children go through the education system, you could argue that they become less curious, less inquisitive.
Yeah.
What tends to happen, and it's just the education system, but also just society, is that as you grow up, you become very quickly attuned to the idea that there's right and wrong. And people that get stuff wrong are not very good at things or might be deemed to be stupid.
Yeah.
And people that get things right are the people that are going to be successful and achieve. Now, that obviously completely goes against what my view is as an educator. It's not as simplistic as that.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I started to consider when I first became a head teacher at my first school was, how do I motivate the adults that are working for me to actually do the best they possibly can in their various different management roles? And I didn't get it right straight away, because when you become a head, there's kind of, you've got this idea in your head that you have to act like a certain way because people have got a perception of what a head teacher's like. So I think the first 6 months,
I won't tell you what mine is, Glenn.
yeah, but most people, that's the thing. Everyone went to school,
Yeah.
so everyone's got an experience of their own teachers in their own heads, whether they liked them or they didn't. And when you become a head, you can't help but have a slight imposter syndrome, thinking, "How on earth did I ever get to this position of responsibility? I better act and do things a certain way so people don't find me out."
Yeah.
But I think that probably lasted. I'm hoping it only lasted 6 months. But what I suddenly realized was that if I wanted to skill up my teams, then I had to apply the same principles that I did when I was a class teacher. And I know it might sound really simplistic, but you have to start from the basic of, like Maslow. If children or adults do not come into a learning situation where they feel safe, where they've had something to eat, where they've had a decent night's sleep, where they feel looked after, where they actually feel that they're going to be treated with respect, then they're never going to be able to learn. What becomes more sophisticated as you go along is that different people come to that learning environment with a different amount of baggage. For example, within schools, we would talk about our most disadvantaged children, and the way in which we think of it in terms of an image is, we would say, imagine that you've got a bag of poker chips, and each time that you give a chip away, okay, that's potentially something to do with your confidence or your self-esteem. Okay.
Yep.
So you will have some children that are coming to school each day and their bag's completely full. And so it doesn't matter if they get things wrong; they'll just throw poker chips away, and they're never going to worry about it because they've got an endless supply.
Yep.
So it's like when you go on a training course and you'll have someone call out answers over and over again, regardless of whether they're right, because they're really not fussed about whether they get it wrong. Okay, they're so secure in themselves and they're so happy with who they are, they don't mind making mistakes. Okay, but you'll always have a child who's either only got one or two poker chips in it, or their bag's really small, and so trying to get it out is really, really hard. And they'll spend most of their time thinking about the fact of, when am I going to use that? So they might not engage, they might not say anything, because their fear is if they use their one thing and they get it wrong, what else have they got left? They might as well give up and walk out. And so from a teaching point of view, we've got to try and judge all the children that come through our class and know how many chips have they got and where are they likely to feel most comfortable spending them. But that's exactly the same with adults. If I was to lead a staff meeting on, let's say, maths, because people will talk about maths in a fixed mindset. They'll go, "Oh, I could just never do it."
Yep. Hand up.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
we've had that conversation.
yeah, but it's not the. But I always add "yet" on the end of that, so you might not be able to do it yet. I generally have the belief that everybody can learn things and get better at stuff. But as adults, people have had this conceived idea that this is it. This is my. I've reached that fixed point. I can't learn anything more than that. Okay, and so what we would do when we'd look around the room within the staff room is we'd actually think, well, which people are going to find this difficult, and which people are going to find this easy, and we would apply the same strategies we would in class. So a strategy might be for children, we might do pre-learning. So we might make sure that children have got key knowledge and skills before we do the lesson, so that those gaps that they might have, they feel more confident with.
Mhm.
And we would do that with adult staff as well. So we would have a conversation with them about what was coming, just to prepare them and say, you might want to read this, do this, so you're feeling kind of more prepared. Then once you're in a session, either training with adults or children, you might actually think about the different types of activities you're doing. So if we're trying to maintain the children or adults kind of confidence levels and self-esteem, actually trying to avoid anything like show and tell. So don't have all things written on whiteboard so you can compare your answers, so you'll just sit there and everyone else is right and I'm wrong. So you create activities and tasks and the way in which they're presenting their work in a way that is kind of non-threatening. You might pair people up. So you might put someone who's really confident with someone less confident. You might decide not to do that because this person's then going to dominate, and that person is just going to let them, because they'd rather let that person do all the work and pretend they're getting it right than take a risk and get it wrong. So there's lots of things that teachers do every single day to try and think about, how do we help that child get from A to B? And it's not just the academic journey that has to be factored in. It's not just, well, for this child to get from A to B, we're going to give them extra adult support, we're going to give them scaffolding, we're going to give them resources, we're going to help them work with a child that's already an expert in that particular domain. Okay. So we do that for academics, but what we'd also be thinking about is how are we looking after them in terms of an emotional well-being point of view. So have they come in? Are they ready to learn? Are they comfortable? Have they got the resources they need? Have we created an environment within the class that is safe to make mistakes? All of those kind of things. So there's those two factors that run throughout when we do any training for staff, and we pretty much do that because that's what we know works for children and how they learn.
Perfect. Okay, I'm going to stop there because I'm going to do a mud check. And you, I've noticed, haven't been drawing anything.
I haven't.
Glenn, you've been failing
Sorry.
on your multitasking. But if it helps, I've been failing on my drawing. So I've resorted this time to some pretty flowers.
Is that because I've been talking too much, so you've had an opportunity to draw?
No, well, I'd expect you to talk a lot because you're supposed to be the guest. Something's gone wrong if I'm the one doing the talking. I've also drawn, well, what I hoped was me, but I think is more of a ghost at this point.
Okay.
Which is, it's mildly terrifying, but it is Halloween, which also explains, I hope, why Dave now appears to be sort of dinosaur.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Some kind of warthog.
Yeah, it started badly and it got worse. So this, not my best work, I'm afraid, but there we go. We'll try and save it later.
Okay.
So there's a couple of other topics we've spoken about a lot, and you kind of spoke about the similarities between adult and child learning, which I 100% agree with, and there is psychology, that talks about the differences, and of course we have to use big, very complex pedagogical, which I can't say, and the other one, which I can never remember, and I'm not quite sure why we choose to use that language, given that we're supposed to be educators and making things simple for people. But whatever. I do agree. I think there is a lot of similarity. I think the baggage is possibly sometimes different, but often you'll talk about, well, when you're an adult, you need an intrinsic reason to learn. You need to know why you're learning. There needs to be some sort of motivator. I think, well, I look at my kids and I don't think that's any different. It's the motivator might be slightly different, but I don't think any child will choose to learn something if there isn't a reason to be doing it. They may learn by accident, but I think that's the same for adults, because I think when you become an adult, you change your view of what learning is.
Yeah.
Right. So learning is very structured and it's a thing that you do and you take time to do. And you don't necessarily see it as something that just happens all of the time. Every time you make a mistake, every time you have a conversation with someone, you're always learning something. But as an adult, that seems to disappear, right? You just apply that to children. They're playing, but they're learning something.
Mm-hmm.
You don't apply that back to yourself when you're doing things. I find that very odd, and we seem to think of it as very, very different. But anyway, I wanted to talk about, and coming on to that kind of playing, I guess, that the experiential, the playing through doing, or the learning through doing aspect, right? It seems very, now I'm going to say it seems very baked in schools. It didn't feel like it when I was in school. Maybe I misremember, right? And maybe there was much more of it when I was at school than I remember. But when I was at school, at least, it felt very, here's a blackboard on that old, and we're going to write on it, and you're going to get your book out and you're going to read your book, or you're going to copy down what I've written, right? Science slightly different, I accept. Drama obviously naturally different. Sport was sport, but it felt like a lot of the time it was sat at a desk with a pen and a bit of paper and doing stuff. It feels very different now. So complete ownership. I'm a governor at one of the schools or two of the schools that Glenn looks after, and I will be plugging the importance of becoming a governor if you work in the learning world at the end of this, and we'll put some links in the description on kind of how you can learn more. But from what I've seen, and as a parent, it feels much more learn through doing, learn through being engaged and practicing and playing with stuff and playing with ideas and getting stuff wrong. In the corporate world, we talk about it a lot, but the reality is what ends up a lot is PowerPoints or e-learning delivered to you. Some of that is just a scale thing, right? We don't have one person to 30 employees. We've got one person to 1,000, if not more. But there are ways, I think, to still enable, especially with some of the newer digital technologies that are coming, right, to enable that kind of learning through doing and playing space. It would be good to understand your perceived value of that from an educational perspective with the children, but also with your own staff, and the importance of that side of it, and what you think corporate could take to do some of that at scale. Because again, it's still done at relatively scale within the education sector.
In terms of what I'll have to do, though, is pick apart within the educational sector. There is a difference between kind of experiential learning and kind of learning through practice and actually physically doing things.
Yep.
Okay. So within the early years foundation stage curriculum, a lot of what they will do there is it's initiated play. So the teachers and support staff very skillfully set up various kind of activities that sometimes are connected to a theme and sometimes they're not. And as the children's naturally engage with different games and activities, what they do is they'll drop in kind of key questions, and what they'll do is they'll try and help the children move their learning on and learn new skills such as taking turns or socializing or description or maths and so on. But that's very much child led, and so the structures that the adults put in place from that point of view is really trying to give a range of different experiences that they think the children will engage with. So trying to find out what the children like and what's going to motivate them is key. If they can't relate at all to an area that's been set up, then they're not going to go and engage with it. So that's very much in terms of kind of learning through play. In terms of best practice of how people learn, our general belief from like kind of a pedagogical point of view is that a session should have some key skills or learning objectives that you're focusing on. From the very beginning of any session, the children should know what it is that they're trying to get better at. And then the idea is that if you were delivering a session, whether or not it was an hour session or if it was with adults and you were doing longer sessions, is you actually thinking about, well, how much key information or key concepts are you trying to deliver at any one point, and what different range of activities are you going to try to use to help that stick with the children or the adults moving forward. Because I think there's so much research out there now that shows kind of cognitive overload is huge. Yet as adults, we will still sit there for 3 hours and listen to someone just talk at you and go through maybe 400 or 500 different bits of information. Whereas we all know that generally, once you get past through the first 6 or 7 key bits, you can't remember it. Yeah. You can't retain it. You most definitely can't apply it. So from a learning kind of through practice and it being more learning through experience, our general practice is that a teacher will explain these are the skills and objectives we're looking to get better at. Sometimes you might share a waggle. So a waggle is what a good one looks like.
Excellent.
Okay.
Good.
Sometimes you might share a wabble, which is what a bad one looks like. Okay. And so the children have got a clear outcome of what the goal is. And then you might ask them, well, if this is what a waggle looks like, what's the key skills and things you're going to need to be able to develop? You might ask the children to self-assess to start off with and go, well, okay, these are the key skills to be able to do this. So, for example, if you're doing an art lesson and you're trying to teach children how to draw foreground, background, and show perspective, okay, you could show a waggle and you could say to the children, okay, which bits of this are you feeling really confident with? I could draw the bit at the front, I could draw the bit at the back, but I might get the sizes wrong, but I've got no idea how to show depth perception and kind of things like this, okay? So you can get people to self-assess, and then what you should then do is break the skills or objectives down into small chunks and then teach that skill, and then but let the children then have a go at doing it.
Yeah.
So with that art lesson coming back, I might say to the children, right, this is the horizon line going down the middle. That dot in the middle is the vanishing point. Everything that goes from the foreground to the background has to go back to that point. And I might get them just to draw a road going into the distance, just so you can see how it's big up here, narrow down here. Okay. And I'll say to them, right, have a go. Okay. Everyone can have a go. You can walk around. For the children that have still got a road that looks like that, they haven't quite understood. For the children that have got it wiggly, they might not have understood. A child might be exceptional at this already, and you might go, well, actually, whilst I'm going to check on everybody else, can you draw some houses on the right hand side of the road, put a bench and a park on the left? So they're still practicing the same skill, but they're just doing it at a slightly more sophisticated level. But what you're actually doing is you're focusing on one or two key things. You're modeling a skill or departing a piece of knowledge, but mindful of the fact you're not giving too much information, and then you let the children have a go. Then they actually review and assess against what the key skill was, and if they've all got it, you then move on to the next bit. But it should be done in manageable chunks, on the understanding that if you try to teach too much too quick, then they're only going to have a surface level understanding of it. So that's what the majority of lessons should look like outside of early years. And it obviously differs in terms of how much information, how much complexity is given, depending on the age of the child and the level of ability.
Yeah, and I think your point you made earlier, right, that it's almost that safe space of getting it wrong is so important for that to work, right?
Yeah.
That ability for people to feel, well, it doesn't matter if I don't get it right first time, because someone's going to help me and I can learn and then I can do it better next time. That's so critical. And I'm not sure we're always fantastic at building that into corporate learning. And what I will say from my time of delivering learning, which is a little while ago now, but the bane of my life was always learning objectives. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I absolutely agree. When you think about designing them, you should absolutely have them, and people should have clarity about what you're trying to engage them in and to help them learn. But corporate version of learning objectives was, and for a lot still is, here's 4 bullet points at the beginning, and I'm going to tell you by the end of this session you will have learned blah 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 blah, and you don't see them again till the end where you go, well, we've done it and now you've learned blah blah blah. And it's almost an afterthought and not really embedded into the design of the session itself and the practical strategy used to apply the learning.
In that context, though, if you just share the skills that they're learning without the why, so in this example, the waggle's the why. This is what you're learning to do. Okay, this is what we're hoping to achieve by the end of this session, and to do that, you need these things. Those things then should be your regular reference points for you to assess against. But they also give you a sense of kind of safety and structure for the children, because you're going to work through these things, and if you're planning it carefully, you should sequence those objectives at kind of sophistication level. So they might get harder the more that you go on. But you need to keep referring back to it, because otherwise the people that are learning have no real idea what it is that you're learning, how well you're doing against it. But then you have to keep coming back to the why as well.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing is they were often just said at the beginning, said at the end, and I'm putting them in because I've always been told that I need to talk about learning objectives, rather than the understanding the importance of them around the design of what you're trying to do and the structure of what you're trying to do.
One of the huge advantages we have in terms of schools is that it's all delivered within a culture and ethos that's been created by everything that you do within the school, from how you talk to the children, to how the environment looks, to your behaviour policy, to your teaching and learning policy. So, for example, the idea of making mistakes, we might look at James Nottingham's Learning Pit when it talks about basically the imagery for children is really kind of straightforward. So what you have is you have a big pit, Okay, and this side's always higher to show some kind of educational growth. Okay, and then what generally happens is the pit is the bit where you don't know what to do. So
Yeah.
this is the bit of new learning. Okay, and what we would do is we would want people to celebrate being in the pit, because finding out stuff that you can't do is really cool. Because what you can then try and do is figure out, well, what have I got available to me to help me climb out of this pit and then get to the other side?
Yeah.
And so, but if you can drip feed that in everything you do, from your assemblies, from your lesson design to the imagery around the school, it's far easier to get buy-in from the children than it is for adults. If it's a corporate training event, I don't know whether or not they're ever connected, or if they're kind of one-offs. We're going to invest in this, and we're going to get everybody together and basically deliver what is a flat pack of content to a wide audience without really giving any thought about the values behind it, the purpose behind it, the different experience of those people coming in.
Yeah.
And I do think it can be done on a large scale, because the things that I was talking about in terms of start off with the why, give an example, break it down into skills. Even if you're at the front of a large room of 1,000 people, you could model a skill, go, right, now you have a go. Or you go even more dangerous for the audience, and you'd say to them, actually, this is what we're learning to do. What might that look like? Have a go already. So you don't give them the waggle or the wabble. You just tell them the outcome's going to be this. Let's see what you've got now.
Yeah.
And then see but they've got to be brave enough to have a go.
Yeah.
And then they've got to have the ability to pick apart what's not good about it.
Yeah.
But that's why generally the most effective learning for children is it's a sequence. So we don't teach 400 one-off lessons. We teach sequence of 20, 30 lessons where you build on it each time. And the same when we do staff training, we would build on it, and it will always come back to this is our school improvement plan, because this is what we said we need to get better, because this is what we're trying to do for our children when they leave.
Yeah. It's really interesting. Your point, I guess, about the benefit of the educational space is that your strategy is to educate the children.
Yes.
Right? That's the strategy. Whereas in a corporate environment, the strategy of the corporate is usually, let's be blunt, make more money, right?
Yes.
That's broadly what the strategy is. They'll put some nice finessing stuff around it, but it's always make more money. And I think the difference between a really successful organization that has embedded a learning culture versus probably 80-90% of organizations is the ones that have done it well. Their strategy is very focused on learning, on growth, on educating their employees, on upskilling their employees, and not just lip service to it, but it is embedded into, as you say, everything that they do, and creating that culture, that safe space of growth, right? And it's okay to get things wrong. And I think often people talk about a no blame culture. Not many organizations, if any, really deliver upon it, right? So and that's, it's different, right? You can have a no blame culture isn't a no fault culture. People are still responsible for making mistakes, and they still need to be held accountable for it. But you also need to make sure that they are supported to grow and learn from those mistakes. And lots of organizations don't necessarily follow that step, which then falls down right when you then get into, like you say, right, that opportunity of being brave and having a go and showing that you don't know something.
But ideally, that's what you think employers are looking for. You're looking to create a team of people that are risk takers, that are innovative, that are willing to look at things from a range of perspectives and give things a go, because they're not fearful of either getting something wrong or looking stupid in front of their peers. The issue is, though, as you've just said, is that we have the benefit of that we can create that within our school. And because our primary focus is about educating the whole child, it's not just the academic outcome, it's quite straightforward to us. There's not many schools there's no school that I'd know that doesn't have a purpose to actually have a positive impact on their children's lives.
Yeah.
No one sets out to get 90% ARE in maths. This is what we want for our children. Whereas, say, business primarily, it is because you're trying to sell more units, or you're trying to get more customers, or you're trying to make more money. But one of the things we do as a senior leadership team is we would look at successful companies in terms of their culture and their man management to see what we can take from them. So, for example, the Hilton hotel chain has some of the best in terms of well-being strategies for their staff, from an educational point of view, but also from a kind of a nurture and looking after them.
Yeah.
And you've got, like, say, Timpson's as well, in terms of the ownership that they give to their staff, in terms of how they run their shop and so forth. Virgin Airways, if you generally, it's not just their advertising, but when you actually look at all their business model, the why and the purpose is all about customer service, customer satisfaction, and everyone buying into, we want all of our customers coming through thinking that we're exceptional at looking after them. It's not about, we want to have the most amount of passengers on our plane. We want to have the most amount of passengers on our plane that are feeling that this experience is the best you could possibly have. But there's a considerable amount of investment that goes into that. It's not just the training side of things. It is the clarity of the strategy from the most senior members of that organization, and how that gets distilled down and bought into by all the different layers of management throughout.
Yeah. And I think Timpson's is a really good example, because that is fundamentally, I think, a great example of trust is just given immediately. It's not earned, right? They just implicitly trust people and their staff to do the right things. But
their recruitment process, though, is built around that.
Yeah, absolutely. So everything's built around it.
But that's what. But I don't think you can necessarily just bring people in and instantly give them that responsibility and trust. They're very selective in terms of who they appoint and what the selection process looks like. But they make that clear for anybody that's applying for those kind of positions in the first place. Because something we looked at recently was the speed of trust. So it was Covey. So I don't know if it was that the Habitats of Effective Leaders was another book he's written on, called Speed of Trust. And it actually talks about trust not only being a like a positive societal trait that we think, that person's trustworthy, but it actually talks about it as a hugely influential performance indicator. So if you've got companies that are high trust companies, where the employees trust their managers trust the CEOs, and they all buy into the why, then generally you'll find there's less staff absence, there's more staff willing to take risks, you've got people willing to go above and beyond. So what we would look to do from an adult point of view is, well, how can we gain more trust in our staff so that they're buying into what we're doing? But you can also then disseminate that down to the classroom, because children will learn better when they trust you as the adult and trust that what you're giving them is going to benefit them, but also they're going to enjoy the experience along the way.
Yeah, no, 100% agree. Okay. Conscious time. So I just wanted to pick up briefly on our last topic, which is, I think, a really important one. So inclusivity and SEN, so special education needs. I think, certainly from my experience of the schools that I'm a governor of, they're well regarded when it comes to kind of the provision they give children that have neurodiverse needs and special education needs. Corporate world, we talk, many perhaps organisations are talking about neurodiversity, but it's usually after the fact, and it's not really embedded in the strategy and the thought process, right, about how we deliver this. If I took an example, right, there's a set of regulations called the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which is the most boring document, genuinely the most boring document you'll ever read in your life, but incredibly important. And actually, if you deliver learning, online learning, it's incredibly important that you adhere to that document, and is now becoming very, I think, a European regulation. And if you weren't doing it before, you really should be doing it now. But basically, it talks about how you design digital learning content to make it accessible for everybody. So one of the things is that the typical, and you may not have come across this, and lucky you, Glenn, but a lot of compliance learning uses a drag and drop, right? So you have some objects over there and you have some objects over there, and this is classed as interactive, and you drag one from the other to answer the question. Actually, from a neurodiversity perspective, that does not work for a lot of people.
Yeah.
But yet still lots of organisations and companies are designing their content with that in, which immediately excludes a ton of people. We did, when I redesigned a lot of our digital content, working with our compliance teams so that it was applicable to WCAG. We had a guy who worked for us, just one example, who was very partially sighted. His compliance curriculum, which was 8 courses, it would take him 2 weeks non-stop to do that. 2 weeks. Once we've redesigned it, 8 courses, it took him a day. Still longer than I would like.
Yeah.
2 weeks must be the worst 2 weeks of his life for a year. Not only is that horrifically unproductive, right?
Yeah.
But also the experience for him is absolutely hideous.
Yeah.
So as in a corporate world, that's, digital learning is one example, but certainly within the classroom, we're still pretty poor from a neurodiverse perspective. So what can we take from the educational sector around how they manage special educational needs and the work that goes into it from an educational side?
I mean, a lot of what I've said already in terms of would incorporate the way in which we look to meet the needs of our children that are either disadvantaged because of the SEND need or because of other societal factors as well. But generally, it comes down to several strategies. So one is obviously you need to know that child's particular need, and then what are the atypical barriers that that child would need to either be removed or they need to be given devices to get over them.
Yep.
Okay, so if we have got children with ADHD, it might well be that they need fiddle toys so that they can do this so that their brain can work at a better pace. It might be that we've got big rubber bands on the bottom of their chairs, and what they do is they push up and down on this to give them a sense of grounding so they can do that. We might use wobble cushions so you can literally just wobble around whilst you do it. So it's coming up with different kind of distractions. We might have movement breaks where they go and do a sensory circuit. It might be that we're using certain coloured pieces of paper or screens, larger print. We might try to cut down on the amount of noise that's in the room, or we might try to increase it by having certain kind of soothing music on in the background. Some people feel more kind of grounded and more comfortable when there's like scents burning in the class. So I'm not suggesting that we do this for 30 different people. Okay, what I'm actually talking about is for your most complex children. What we have to do is make sure that you identify what the barriers are, and then try to put as many different support mechanisms or strategies in place to help them be able to get to that end goal. Okay, and it's not just a case of giving them an extra adult, because sometimes they need that. But if you just place an extra adult with a child to help them learn, they become so reliant on that they don't have that independence to do it as well. So I suppose what could a corporate world take from that is that you would obviously want to be able to know your team really well, and then you'd want to have the subject knowledge and expertise to know how does that person learn best. And that's ultimately what it comes down to, is how are we going to meet that person's needs to try and make sure that they're successful. But where it comes back to the values again is that myself and my leadership team will regularly refer to the one. If we get it right for our most challenging, our most hard to engage, then you're going to get it right for everybody. Because everything else is going to be either a diluted version or a slightly adapted version to help them be successful. It shouldn't be the other way around. It shouldn't be teach to the norm and hope they can keep up. It should be adapt where at all possible to help them be successful, and you might have to adapt less for other children.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to call it there. There's more that I could talk to you about. There's so much more, but we'll call it there. Just conscious of your time. So last mug check then. So I haven't done much more other than add in a lovely bright orange T2T, which is the title of the podcast, Tricky to Title. So lucky you get to.
Thank you.
You can take that. You can take that to school.
I'm going to go and have a coffee in it now.
Yeah, pretend that one of the children's done it for you.
Mine's less artistic than yours. I was struggling to multitask or think of things that were particularly creative. So I basically put down on there the things where I spend most of my time.
Okay.
So my little stick men and my 5 boys.
Excellent.
Okay, and then generally we spend a lot of time playing cricket, rugby, and football, and I spend a lot of time working.
Fair.
Although what I would say though is I never perceive my job as work. I generally see it as a hobby that I get paid for, which is quite fortunate because I know not everybody else has that privilege.
No, and I have had that before, and it is it's the nicest place to be. Right, okay. So thank you very much, everybody, for watching or for listening. If something has sparked your curiosity, given you an idea, or made you rethink how you might learn, then do let us know. Both myself and Glenn are on LinkedIn. I can see you're massively using of LinkedIn with your 0 posts, Glenn Wilder. Or you can email me at tricky2title@gmail.com. Any questions you have for Glenn, I'll make sure I pass on. I said that I would, but I genuinely have got so much out of being a school governor, but also feel like I can give a lot from the corporate world. So if you do work in learning, or even if you don't, and you're in the UK, I 100% suggest having a look through the description, finding some of the reference material I'll put on there, but taking the time. Schools are always, I don't think I've ever come across a school that's like, oh no, we've got too many governors.
No.
They always need more support.
We have vacancies at all of ours.
Yeah. So 100%, step up and use your expertise, but you will also learn an awful lot from the way that schools go about education that you can bring back into your own role. So last thing for me to say is, as always, I blame ChatGPT for this, and it is the cheesiest sign-off line in the world. But I'm Richard Pedley. Stay curious, stay messy, and don't worry about the title.